we can say is a tremendous historical event is happening. A tremendous shift in the entire political complexion of the world. And I think, fortunately for us, it is a generally positive one. It is the destruction of the Republican Party as a national party in the United States. It is the extinction, if you will, of the Republican Party as a political force overwhelmingly for evil. And naturally, in a country as important as the United States, with a party like the Republicans who have dominated at many levels of government in many states, state legislatures, in the House since 2010, in the Senate since 2014, and contending for the presidency with big money for Jeb Bush or some similar hack figure. This is a very dangerous party. It is the party that brought you, to only go back a little bit, the first Gulf War with Mad Dog Bush the Elder. It brought you then genocide in Iraq. It brought you the creation of the globalized world order under Bush the Elder and James Baker. Those were the Republicans. The first Gulf War, the second Gulf War. The problems with Russia effectively started under the time of Bush. In other words, the great friendship with Putin that then began to break up towards the end, and no real solution for this. It is a party of genocide. It is a party of union busting, of social barbarism inside the United States. It's a party that oppresses women. It's a party that oppresses sexual minorities, trying to deprive them of their rights under the 14th Amendment, working through states. So we're talking about the destruction of the Republican Party, the massive fratricide of the Republicans. They are wiping each other out. Everybody should be observing this and rejoicing. This is the point. When we have two states of the union, right? One coming from Trump and one coming from Nikki Haley. When we have two Republican debates coming out of Iowa, right? The Trump Veterans event with Santorum and Hucksterby, Diabolorum, of course, as we call them. And then you've got the official one across town. This is a time of splitting. You have to remember General de Gaulle of France, right? He would always say, I like Germany so much, I want there to be two of them. It is the most elementary calculation that anybody could make. If you divide your enemies into two parts, and you get one part fighting the other, then you're on your way to success and victory. So what has happened now, obviously, in the past week in particular, with the build-up to this Super Tuesday, we see the Republican Party tearing itself to pieces. And speaking as somebody who has been trying to promote the extinction of the Republican Party as a national force, I've been doing this for years, for decades, certainly going back to my biography of Mad Dog Bush the Elder, that is George H.W. Bush, the unauthorized biography, but then continuing during the Iraq War, right, fighting against Bush the Younger and so forth, fighting also against the libertarian wing of these fakers, right, the Rand Paul, Ron Paul faker wing. It's very interesting. The people who followed those guys claimed to be interested in the Constitution and liberty, and they've now thrown in their lot with the biggest dictator, the biggest strongman, the biggest oppressor, Trump, the biggest fascist, Trump. So you go from libertarianism, anti-authoritarian, to dictatorship. What kind of a doctrine does that to you? Well, Austrian school libertarianism does it, just in the same way that it takes your economy, destroys it, and then makes fascism much more likely. So we've seen the fratricide, the self-destruction of the Republican Party. We want to go through each exquisite detail because each of those has to be savored. Here's the point. We are not supporting a candidate. That is not the idea. I've told you again and again, the candidates are of very little interest, except to the degree that this or that candidate allows you to influence the general process of how the system is breaking up. And of course, the most interesting is Trump, because he's the most obvious fascist. He's the most outspoken, self-declared, self-indicted, self-convicted fascist, racist, bigot of the lot. And he's bringing about the split. In other words, it's hard. I found it impossible, quite frankly, myself, to try to promote the extinction of the Republican Party from the outside. So now what is going on, and this is often the case with social institutions, it is not a first, that the Republican Party is destroying itself. A kind of hysteria, a kind of, again, self-phagocytation, eating oneself, right? Having a feast by eating your leg. That's what has overtaken the Republican Party. So this is nemesis. This is what happens when you systematically violate natural law. These are the furies, what the Greeks would have seen here. A large institution is going down. And of course, it's more than 150 years old, right? It goes back to John C. Fremont running for president for the Republican Party and the Free Soil Party in 1856. And it had a build-up before that. And for the first 30 or 40 years, or at least for the first 10 or so years, the Republican Party was actually a revolutionary party. It was the most revolutionary party on the world stage. It brought about the destruction of slavery, and it brought about, to some extent, the weakening of the Southern oligarchy. That is, from then on, the Southern oligarchy was not able to control the central government in Washington. Right? Up until 1860, the Confederates, the proto-Confederates called the shots. The Southern slaveholders, the slave power conspiracy ran the U.S. government. But after that, they couldn't, until, of course, Richard Nixon came along, right, and made that possible again. Right? So that was a big step backward. Now, the goal is to destroy a party, to destroy a system. The system is this party system that we see. We'll go through a kind of a summary of the party systems in a couple of minutes on the show. We are not interested in promoting a candidate. We have said, the only thing we've ever said about voting is hold your nose and vote for Bernie Sanders. But we have hastened to add, this is not because Bernie or anybody else on the scene is actually qualified for the presidency. We're simply saying we want to keep the process open on the Democratic side. We want the debates, the discussions, the elections, right? We want the political mobilization of the Democrats to go forward, looking towards the convention in July, because we see that Hillary wants to shut it all down. Hillary wants to cut off debate. And since we're the enemies of Hillary, as much as anybody else, we want to prevent her from doing that. So in the Democratic Party, our great enemy is, of course, Hillary Clinton, because she's got to be prevented from wrapping up the nomination, putting away poor Bernie Sanders. In other words, what we're trying to do is essentially we're trying to block the pre-programmed path of Bernie Sanders, which is to capitulate. In other words, to all those people who were going to leave the Democratic Party, he gathers them together, and then when he drops out, he delivers them into the hands of Hillary Clinton. We're trying to prevent that, but in the interest of another party split a little bit further down the road, the Democratic. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we are here between Super Tuesday and Super Saturday, and we are celebrating and documenting the many signs of the breakup, the smashing, the splitting, the splintering of the racist, reactionary, warmongering Republican Party of the United States. It is a barrier, an insuperable barrier to national progress, and it is a threat to the peace of the world. So, that's the Republican Party. We don't need it. We need it to disappear. Now, we're going to mainly talk about the Republican Party here. We got a word about the Democrats. You already can see the fault line of how the Democrats will split, In other words, the only thing that keeps the Democrats together in this situation, the party of Hillary and the party of people who have gotten scooped up by Bernie, even though he's not a leader, but simply by default, you can see that fault line. It's basically going to be the Wall Street people against the progressives, the populists, the New Deal, the pro-labor, whatever you want to call them. Left-wing economic populists is probably a good way to describe them. Bernie, of course, not a leader, simply, again, there by default. This stuff has fallen into his lap more or less because nobody else took it, right? Elizabeth Warren could have done it up to a point. She would have been like Bernie. She would have been essentially a sheepdog or gatekeeper or so forth. But you could also see in the course of Bernie's speech on Tuesday evening, after the Super Tuesday primaries, you could see the spirit of capitulation and defeatism, the tired, resigned, repetitive essence of Bernie's campaign. And even, I think, the New York Times or some prominent news organ pointed out how tired and how close to capitulation Bernie seemed. The headline of that article was that the beginning of Bernie Sanders' concession speech? Well, I urge you people out there who are interested in Bernie or just interested in human progress, if you find yourself in the Democratic Party, you've got to keep holding your nose and you got to keep voting for Bernie. You got to force him to stay in the fray. You got to keep him alive and keep pushing him, right? Think of him as El Cid in the famous Spanish story, right? The guy can be basically no longer in this world, but you can still use him as a figurehead to push forward. So that's a way to do it. We want an open convention. We want an open convention on both sides. We don't want the machine bosses and the smoke-filled rooms to make these decisions. And on the Democratic side, that means you've got to get beyond the first ballot. In other words, you've got to somehow deny Hillary Clinton the nomination on the first ballot. Now, that looks pretty grim, but if she's indicted, right, and the subpoena is now coming her way, the guy who installed her special email server for, putting state secrets up for grabs in a hostile world, all of that. So she's getting hit on the Clinton Foundation conflict of interest taking money, and she's getting hit on the server side, right? Notice that Bernie contributes nothing to any of this, right? Bernie would be embarrassed. He doesn't want to say anything. He won't talk, right? He won't push it. He doesn't say anything about the Goldman Sachs transcripts of the speeches. But nevertheless, if Hillary gets, indicted, more subpoenas and so forth, some people might stand up at this convention and say, look, we cannot vote for this woman because she's going to be indicted or jailed further down the road, and that will mean if it happens in the midst of the campaign, right, in September, October, then the Democratic cause will become very tenuous, maybe hopeless. Now, Bernie, one very astute observer of these things, pointed out, would Bernie accept the Democratic nomination if he won it? Because there is this moment, right, when you give your acceptance speech, you got to stand up there and say, I am honored to accept your nomination as the Democratic candidate for the presidency. Would Bernie do that? Or maybe he'd say, I'm just, I was only here to try to reform campaign finance and show you a new model, right? He talks about his own campaign. The reason black people and other, poor people don't vote for Bernie the way they're supposed to, according to some, is that he's interested in process reforms. His main emphasis is not what he's going to do for you. He talks about free college, okay, but how about, a job program, the main thing, right? Bernie, where's your program for 30 million jobs? He claims that he's got a program for 13 million jobs. He very seldom talks about things. The main thing he talks about that you know from Bernie is that the average contribution to Bernie's campaign is $27. I'm sorry, this is useless. This won't help anybody. You can take this and throw it out the window. And then, as he says in his capitulation speech this past Tuesday, he says this campaign is about much more than running for president, much more than winning the presidency. That's ridiculous. The purpose of a political campaign is to take power, seizing power, the exercise of power. The pursuit of power is the goal of politics, not changing the national conversation. And with that, the national conversation, we're back to Occupy. And some of those people who were saying to foreign audiences in 2012, we changed the national conversation. You're wasting your time. It's pathetic. The U.S. national conversation goes from Honey Boo Boo to Madonna to Lady Gaga to Beyonce to the Stanley Cup and the Super Bowl and the World Series. And it does that by itself. You don't have to do any of that. It's just a normal succession of these idiotic, inane, banal, and corrupting themes. So Bernie has now lapsed into that. He's basically saying, I forced Hillary Clinton to the left. Well, guess what? She will regard that stuff as campaign rhetoric. Remember, Obama ran as an enemy of free trade. He ran as a protectionist, basically. But he also sent Austin the Ghoul Goolsby of Skull and Bones to the Canadian consulate to say, look, this is just campaign rhetoric, right? Don't worry, NAFTA is safe. The giant sucking sound will continue. So the Tax Wall Street Party would like Bernie to say, would he accept the nomination? Because he sure didn't do anything about vote fraud in Iowa. He sure didn't do anything about the Goldman Sachs speeches. He will not talk about her emails, right? So this is capitulation up and down the line. So let's leave him there. The other fault line is Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, who has quit the Democratic National Committee of Debbie Wasserman Schultz because she wants to support Bernie. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, Debbie Wasserman Schultz of the clothing budget. Debbie Wasserman Schultz has also just intervened to try to help the payday loan usurers, right? The rip-off artists who make these usurious, exorbitant interest rate loans to poor dupes and poor desperados and the general wreckage of this economy. So Debbie wants to make it harder for states or harder for the federal government, harder for anybody to regulate payday loans. And, of course, payday loans should be illegal in the sense that there should be a usury law. And it used to be 10%, right, in most states. And that went up until the time of Paul Adolph Volcker, who was brought in by Carter, kept by Reagan, and then brought back by Obama. So he's a bipartisan figure. So this Tulsi Gabbard had been the vice chair, right? The deputy secretary, in other terms, right, European terms, the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee, Tulsi Gabbard, now says she wants to quit, and is quitting, has quit the Democratic National Committee, because in that position she has to be neutral. She doesn't want to be neutral. She wants to be in favor of Bernie Sanders. So there you go. So that's the fault line. In other words, this is exactly what would happen in the case of a split. Now, let's look at a few things. Let's talk about game theory as taught by the Tavistock Institute in London, right? One of the great brainwashing centers of the world, and also by British Brigadier General Frank Kitson, what he did with and against the Mau Mau in Kenya, and what are the ramifications. This was the gang and the counter gang. Now, here's the problem. Because of the popularity of spectator sports, right, the Super Bowl and the long season in baseball and, March Madness, it's going to be on us, right? The general tendency in this culture is when you see a contention, a game, in effect, you're supposed to pick one side and root for the one side and be a fan. Now, this was already a degradation of intelligence. So we are here to tell you, the Tax Wall Street Party and yours truly, we want to tell you, when you see two parties contending, fighting, whatever it is, you must resist this stupid, abject, slave-inculcated tendency to pick one side against the other. No, why not take a step back, analyze the entire game, and then kick over the game board. Kick over the game board. Don't take sides. Put the whole game through the ringer and shut it down. So when you see a gang and a counter gang, the ruling class, right, the enemy, the financiers, the oligarchs, they want you to see a gang and a counter gang, and then you're supposed to say, well, I'm going to support the gang. Or, no, I'm going to support the counter gang. So the gang, of course, is the traditional leadership of the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, the Koch brothers with their finances, and then, of course, the candidates, people like Bob Dole and John McCain, and the Mormon leader Mitt Romney, who has now been heard from this week. We'll try to give you a quick summary of what he had to say. That's one gang. Now, the other counter gang is Trump with the open language of dictatorship. Open. Strongman. Man on horseback. Mussolini. He practically endorsed Mussolini this week. Now, there's some contention about whether Mussolini said this stuff about better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. However, I don't think we're ever going to find proof that Mussolini never said that under any circumstances. Maybe somebody out there has the complete works and complete speeches, above all, and the table talk and the private diplomatic talk and whatever else of Mussolini. You would have to really go some to prove that Mussolini never said that. Anyway, we didn't hear Trump coming out condemning Mussolini. Obviously, his attitude would be, he's a great leader, like Trump, right? Mussolini and Trump in the same class.